Hello and welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, where we talk about religion, popular culture, and everything in between. I am Vivian Asimos, and as always, I am joined by my lovely friend, colleague, all-around nice guy, Alan Thomas.
Well, that's the nicest introduction I've ever had. Thank you, Vivian. How are you?
I'm good. It's Love Island season at time of recording, so that
course.
has been taking up the entirety of my life.
So you've got your anthropologist hat on while watching
Yes.
people sitting by the swimming pool. That's all I'm aware of that show, is that people sit around a swimming pool.
We should one day, me and you should just sit down for a while and I will just give you a huge crash course for like a weekend in Love Island.
That sounds great.
But we are not talking about Love Island today.
We are not.
Unfortunately.
Maybe another day.
Maybe a different day we'll have an episode on Love Island. But today, we're talking actually about nostalgia. We're talking about how nostalgia interacts with popular culture and how it interacts with religion and how all of that works together in the big old messy pile that is the study of religion and popular culture together. So, nostalgia, for anyone who doesn't know, is essentially just sentimentality for the past. Things, experiences, relationships, anything that can kind of fall under that kind of, bless you.
Thank you. Hopefully that won't have been picked up on the recording.
Yeah, so sentimentality for the past, it's always typically associated with happy memories. You don't typically associate the word nostalgia with negative things. It's always very positive, happy, easier times, simpler times. These kinds of phrases are always kind of beaten around along with nostalgic ideas. And a lot of times you hear it being explained and interacted with and discussed and understood through popular culture. So I think the popular culture angle might be the best place to start for this conversation, because I think it's the easiest one that people can grab onto and go, yeah, I feel that too, in a really easy way.
Yes.
And I know, Alid, that you have a lot of nostalgia regarding music when we talk about popular culture.
So much. And it's quite powerful, isn't it? That sometimes I think nostalgia is something we can crave. I definitely do crave nostalgia. So it is a very interesting one. Yes, very much with music, and also with video games. Video games can be incredibly nostalgic as well for me.
Yes.
Which I'm sure is the case for you.
Yeah, I think I get it more with video games than music. But that being said, just the other day, my husband and I were sat on the couch flipping through YouTube, going to different pop punk groups from like the early 2000s, and having this like, oh, I remember that, and like putting on a song and going, oh, I remember this. And we put on, I am not ashamed to say, we put on Good Charlotte. And for some reason, I remembered every single lyric in a Good Charlotte song when I don't remember basic important facts regarding my research.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think pop punk in particular is quite nostalgic for our generation. My wife, for example, has an encyclopedic knowledge of pop punk bands. It's her jam. But I get it. I'm the sort of person who my music doesn't really fade away from me. I don't really listen to things and think, oh, I haven't listened to this in so long, I remember this. I tend to still listen to the stuff that I was really into. Maybe
so you have like your same like 10 groups that you just stick with all the time.
Yes and no, but I think it's also testament to how much music I listen to. I would say I listen to music about 5 hours a day.
Fair.
At least, and that's on a working day. I'll always find, so I do frequently revisit the artists that I know and love, but also I've got a lot of memories associated with them. I'm a frequent gig goer, or I was a frequent gig goer before the current apocalypse.
Before the end of days.
Indeed. So a lot of those memories come back to me as well from listening to the music of seeing the band play this song live and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really miss those days.
Yeah, I
So
think yeah, a lot of what we're talking about are kind of that immaterial collection, for lack of a better term, of
yes, yes.
sitting back and listening to music, which obviously you can't touch music. I mean, you can touch written music, for example, but that's not the same as listening to it. But then there's also a lot of physical things that you can associate with it. And I know that you are a big vinyl collector.
I am, yes, provided that they're reasonably priced. I love vinyl. It's not perfect, like some people will make you think that it is. And there are perks to streaming and digital music, so I'm not one of those um, typically old male musos who will tell everyone that they're listening to music the wrong way. It doesn't matter which way you listen to music. It's more important that you're listening on a good stereo than it is that you're listening to vinyl. But anyway, yes, I do enjoy listening to vinyl, and there is that tactile nature to it, because the artwork is so much larger than it is on a CD and certainly than a thumbnail on Spotify. You get to appreciate that. You get to hold the records. You think, oh, what's new on this that I haven't heard before? If it's something from one of your favorite acts, you put it down. You put the needle the um, on the record itself. I feel like listening to vinyl forces you to listen more. It forces you to pay attention because you also know in 15 minutes time you're gonna have to get up and flip that record over. You can't just put a playlist on and just let it play all day. There's a commitment as well, so it's not something that you can really do in the background. If you're listening to vinyl, you tend to be listening, so then that gives you the opportunity to read the lyric sheet and whatnot. um, but also, I guess what's really interesting with vinyl is that you can literally see the music because of the grooves, and
Right.
those grooves are unique because that record has been cut to because it's essentially plastic. So sometimes vinyl blows my mind when I think about it because it's such archaic technology, but it's also so clever. So those grooves you see on the record, that is the music, and I think that's the closest you can come to seeing a recorded piece of music, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, that's cool. I've never really thought about it that way. I'm not really a vinyl person, but mostly because the barrier of entry financially, I think, is quite quite steep. And
Once you get a turntable, you're then fine. It's getting the turntable that's the problem.
yeah, but then I'd have to also get vinyl records, and I think there's a
Yeah.
certain amount of
I guess
I'm
that's the problem with all your family being back in the States, is that I was just
yes.
able to steal all my dad's old records because
I
my dad hates vinyl.
I don't think my family has any vinyl records anymore.
Oh, did they sell them off?
I think so. But my both of my parents aren't massive music heads. I think they enjoy music, but not more than it's fun to put on in the background while you're doing something else sometimes thing. So me and my sisters are much more into music because we played music for a really long time. And so I think there's kind of it would have to skip a generation.
Yeah. So then you'd be going back to really old records.
But so I think this is kind of interesting though, because I think there's also a nostalgia sometimes for things and experiences you didn't necessarily personally experience. So the fact that you're getting your parents' vinyls as opposed to yours
Yeah.
that you had when you were younger.
Yeah, this reminds me actually that one of the records I stole from my parents when I bought my turntable was a copy of Kate Bush, The Kick Inside, which was my mum's copy when she was a teenager, and really good condition. And I took the record out of the sleeve, and the dust cover, or the dust sleeve, for the record itself was covered with art from my mum, from my
Oh.
teenage mum, and she had done art for every track on the album.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, I should take a photo of it to show you. And it was just I took a photo of it and I sent it to my mum, and she had completely forgotten about it. When she gave me the record, it didn't occur to her that she'd doodled essentially all over. So she'd given every song title a really snazzy font, and there were all these colours and so on. And it was just really interesting to get that glimpse of my teenage mum
Yeah.
firsthand. And she took good care of the record too. It sounded really good. Um, but there was that nostalgia for something that I wasn't there for. And similarly, my dad gave me a box of all his Queen records. Queen are a really important band to me and my dad. And he gave me a box of his Queen records. And when I opened the box, the ticket that he had when he saw Queen live in 1979 was stuck in the box. And it's still there now as well. So that's really cool as well. So I've got two things of my parents' musical teenage years that are very them. That's
Yeah.
really nice. See, I'm getting all nostalgic now, and I wasn't even around in the 70s.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you can kind of have these nostalgic moments for things you never personally experienced, and they can be kind of related to family, and they can be related to kind of wider cultural social elements. I know that I was always really TV show wise, because you can have nostalgia with TV shows, obviously. I was always really into Columbo
Okay,
because I would watch it with my dad. So, but it was an old show when I was a kid.
yeah.
You know, so we would watch Columbo and these old like whodunits and stuff, and which in retrospect, my dad is not the best person to watch those things with because so he worked as a homicide detective
Wow.
before he retired, and watching those things with him, Columbo was always the better one because you already know who did it. It's just a matter of proving it. But with like other whodunits where you don't know who did it, my dad in the very beginning would be like, "Oh, it's that guy," and then. And it would always be right, and it was always really frustrating.
So you had your own Poirot sat in the living room.
Yeah, but I think that, like, you know, like me and my husband have been watching Poirot like very gradually, and you know, which again is an old show from probably even before, you know, there's
the David Suchet version.
yes,
Oh, of course.
it's the only one we can watch. I mean,
Well, it's he's the only Poirot. With all due respect to every Poirot out there. Yeah, absolutely. I've also noticed when, fans of the podcast will know that we're really into the Zelda series. And we have an episode on Zelda and mythology that you should check out if you haven't already. But I've noticed when we discuss Zelda, you'll often mention how your mum played Zelda while she was pregnant.
yes, when she was pregnant, she would have. My mom had very sleepless nights during pregnancies, and so she would stay up and play Zelda all night. And she would also tell stories about, because obviously this was before the days of the internet, so she would go to the mall where there was a bookshop, and she would find the cheat book, like with the walkthrough in it, and she would quickly look up where she was to figure out the next step and then quickly put it away and stick it back on the shelf.
Brilliant. I mean, you can't complete that game without a walkthrough anyway.
Yeah,
so I don't think anybody should judge her for that.
No, but it was just like this, and she would always kind of tell those stories. And growing up, we would be playing them, and she would be sat on the couch. And even the 3D Zeldas, which she didn't really play, she would be sat on the couch with us going, "Oh, well, what happens if you pull that lever?" And like be trying to kind of, solve the puzzles with us. And so it was always this kind of family experience, but also there is this weird connection of playing the old games and thinking about, I don't know, my pregnant mom trying to stay up playing this game on the NES that we had, like I was playing on the same console, and there was that physical stuff, and then also that immaterial playing and thinking about what it was like for this form of the person that I didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed that when you tell that story, you always refer back to it with such fondness. And you weren't there. I mean, you technically were, but but you also weren't. I love stuff like that, and I also share your nostalgia for video games. They're and I think it's something that the market of pop culture really does pay attention to. I mean, we're both Nintendo fans, and we know that Nintendo love to play on people's
Yes.
nostalgia. I mean, I can't even think of another form of pop culture that plays on nostalgia as much as Nintendo games do,
Yeah,
because
I
they've
think
got this heritage.
Nintendo has really built a company, an empire off of nostalgia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're playing the most recent Mario game, Mario Odyssey, there are moments where you can go into the wall and then you're 8-bit Mario. You've played Odyssey, haven't you?
I have,
Yeah,
yes.
and then you're 8-bit Mario, and it's such a nostalgia trip. And it's a good gameplay mechanic. I don't think it's a cheap inclusion, but at the same time, you think, yes, well done, Nintendo. You've got heritage. Pat yourselves on the back.
But there is something really complicated with nostalgia of video games because our memories of it, and this is something interesting with nostalgia more generally, is that our memories of it are always going to be way better than the actual experience of it was.
Oh Lord, yes.
And so sometimes when you go back to play old games and they're not quite as clean as you remember them being, and the graphics aren't as mind-blowing as you remember them being, and we had this a lot with my family. Also played the King's Quest games on the personal computer. We played them on the PC growing up, and that was another game that my mom played a lot when before she had children, and then her whole life changed. So, but we played those as well when we were kids, and I remember them a lot differently than I did before. So I went back to play them. Just a couple of years ago, and I was like, oh, this is like, I can't even really tell what's going on. And it was the first three of them, you had to do the input commands. So you had to be like, go talk to red, talk to red, talk red, red talk, because you don't know what form of the command will make the person do the thing you want them to do, and it's so infuriating. But there was a fan redid the first three with slightly better graphics and with a point and click rather than a input commands.
Okay.
So I played those, and
Yeah.
those are so much better.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you know I've recently been replaying the Metroid games because there's a new Metroid coming out in October, and faced with the choice of playing the original Metroid on the NES or the remake Zero Mission, I obviously chose the remake because it's
Yeah.
far more playable and far more enjoyable. I think video games as a medium has evolved at such a rapid rate compared to other forms of pop culture that it can be so shocking to go back to older video games. But then it can still be a thrill to
Yeah.
play those old ones. I went to a computer museum in Cambridge. I can't remember what the name of it is. A while back, and they had old consoles set up to TV that you could just play. And they had a copy, and they had a Nintendo 64 and a copy of GoldenEye, which was emphasis
The
on
game.
which was the greatest shooting game ever made. And at this point, I was into playing games like Overwatch and things like that. So gaming, shooting games have come a long way. And I said to Toria, "Oh, this is GoldenEye," because she didn't have an N64; she was a PlayStation kid. And I was like, "This is GoldenEye. Oh, okay. I got to show you this. Your mind's gonna be blown by how amazing GoldenEye on the N64 is." And oh my god, it sucked. It's it was still, I still had that thrill of the music, the sound effects, and things like that. But the controls are so bad, and the mechanics are so bad. It was revolutionary at the time, but it stunned me because I was still remembering it as this 60 frames per second, fluid, beautifully controlled game with great visuals, not a block that is presumably meant to be Pierce Brosnan. So yeah, that was surprising. So she was looking at it with these 21st century eyes, thinking, "Is he insane? This looks terrible." And then there
Yeah.
was just this moment of silence where I just had to admit to her, yeah, it doesn't really hold up. Some
Yeah, I
games
think it's
do.
the It's the tricky thing with it. And I think that's what Nintendo has kind of done really well, and almost why it has survived off of nostalgia is because they know how to make the remake what you remembered.
Mm.
And I think that's a really interesting key point of when you are replaying Ocarina of Time, but it's the HD remake, and it's like, yeah, this is Ocarina of Time.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it's not. It's because if you looked back at it, you would be like, ugh, that is some triangles.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Some of their games do hold up, though, I will say. Like Super Mario World on the SNES, just as a side note, still holds up to this day.
Well, yeah, I think pixel art might stand up a little bit better in that sense because
I
it's
meant
become
just in terms of
stylized.
controls.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
there's
that
too.
control, that game controls so beautifully. Whereas I like the old Mega Man games, but you've got to be very patient to play old Mega Man games. Because when he jumps, he falls like a ton of bricks. Anyway,
Yeah.
I digress.
Yeah, but then there's video games I think can kind of update things and play on the nostalgia in a way that connects you without it being just a complete reproduction that then lets you down. And some TVs and movies can do this. So recently, well, semi-recently, there was that movie Knives Out. Did you see this?
I
With,
love Knives Out. I
this
love that
with
appalling
the
American accent.
I was about to say with the strangest Southern accent I've ever heard in my
Yes.
life. But yeah, so I think that one is it plays on the whodunit in a way that I think you think of when you think of those really old kind of Columbo, Poirot films and movies and TV shows, and then you watch it and you go, oh yes, this really feeds into it, but then the colors and the way they do it is a lot more intricate.
Yes. Yeah, there's a twist on Knives Out because it starts out and you think, oh, okay, I've got it figured out straight away. But then as
Yeah.
it goes along, you realise you don't have it figured out. And it does play on those old tropes that are quite nostalgic, like the Poirot thing of gathering everyone in the parlour at the end
Yes.
to say how it all went down and things like that. They're just those little things that we identify with the whodunit. That's really fun. But it was also really fun to see Daniel Craig clearly have a blast with that
Yes.
part because he's usually in such serious, gritty roles that it was just nice to see him just have fun.
Yeah.
So there was something there was a whimsical side to it that really did play off the early Poirot shows and the other whodunits.
Yeah, and it kind of shifted the different mode of it because with like Columbo, you know who did it, and it's all just a matter of like getting away with it or not getting away with it. And I feel like Knives Out kind of kept flipping between those two forms of the whodunit, which is like you say, at a point you think you have it figured out, so then it's like, well, then how is this gonna unfold, rather than who did it, and then it flips again back to, but then wait, who did it? So it's a very interesting movie for that. But yeah, so I think TV shows, movies, video games can kind of all play with nostalgia and present you something new that still can play up that old sense of like, ooh, I remember this. And I think what's interesting about the aspects of the ones that we didn't technically experience, you know, we talk about it from the familial perspective. We've talked about, you know, I didn't personally experience my mother staying up late at night playing, but I have that connection to her, which makes it kind of play off of that in a way. But there can be kind of wider aspects of this where it's a much wider social or cultural nostalgia. And I think this is where religion can start having a lot of a stronger hold in the conversation when we talk about societal nostalgia. And I think religion itself can be very nostalgic and play on those senses of social nostalgia and cultural nostalgia. And we see this a lot more with like events and celebrations.
Yes.
And Christmas, I think, is a big one in the UK and the US as far as nostalgia goes. And I think that even the not religious families connect to Christmas because of this aspect of nostalgia, which is a really fascinating thing. And maybe one day we'll get on my friend Lucinda Murphy. I've interviewed her twice on the old versions of this podcast, so you can go back and listen to them, and maybe I'll get her on this version of it again. But she's researching Christmas, and she talks quite a bit about that sense of cultural, social nostalgia connected to Christmas.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I often go out of my way at Christmas time to watch the carols on TV, whether it's if they're showing Midnight Mass on BBC One, or there's carols on Christmas morning that I will just put on and have in the background while we're making Christmas dinner or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't define myself as religious. I'm not Christian, but there's something about listening to Christian hymns and carols at Christmas time that I get a kick out of. It takes me back to Christmases of my youth, and it's just a thing that I do now. So I want to hear those carols, and and that is a religious action in itself. I am appreciating Christian music, and regardless of why I am partaking in it, I am partaking in a religious action.
Yeah.
So it's reasons like that, and this is what we talk about on this podcast, about blurring the boundaries between pop culture, religion, and the non-religious, is that often you engage in the act of religioning without realizing, and that's certainly the case for me with Christmas carols and Christmas hymns. I love it. I don't call myself Christian. I wouldn't consider myself a Christian, but I'm still engaging with religioning in a Christian sphere.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you'll, put on music and sing along to praising Jesus's birth if you're not a Christian.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And it's powerful, and it is the nostalgia as well. That is nostalgia and religion that's drawing me back to a time when I was young, when I remember those being, played in my parents' house, because my parents really enjoyed listening to Christian hymns as well at Christmas. So, and it also comes back to what we were just discussing about things being passed down from our parents.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, and obviously we can edit this out if you're uncomfortable talking about it, but are your parents Christian?
They are not.
So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So they do the cultural Christian aspect of celebrating Christmas. But yeah, my dad, for example, he listens to Gregorian chant. Partly because he can have a bit of a pretentious streak in him, if you're wondering where I get it from. I say that with all the love in the world. But he will listen to it purely because he likes the sound of it. It's not active religioning on his part, for want of a better term. So yeah, I wasn't raised Christian. My parents aren't Christian, but those hymns clearly had a place in our household.
Yeah, did you ever question it as you grew up, of kind of wondering why, or was it always just part of Christmas and you didn't?
I sort of did, in the way that I was one of those teenagers in particular who really grappled with the God debate. And I did go through a period of, why am I doing this? In my late teens, I went through a long agnostic phase, and in my late teens, I decided, okay, I'm an atheist. And I went through that very brief period of new atheist mentality that I am happy to say I grew out of, where I was just trying to reject anything religious, despite the fact I was absolutely fascinated with it. I then went, I then did a degree in religious studies and appreciated that religion is in absolutely everything.
Yes.
But, if you please remember, I am referring to my 16-year-old self here. So I did question it in that sense, but growing up, I didn't think, isn't it strange that we're listening to this, but we're not going to church. So we didn't go to church to sing these hymns, but we had them. My parents would buy CDs or if it was on TV, they'd have it on. And I think they had a nostalgia for it. Um, my grandfather's a chapel attendee, and Welsh chapels are known for their singing. So I think
Yeah.
maybe my dad derived his love for it from there. But it certainly wasn't presented to me as, oh, we listen to this because we worship. Oh, we listen to this because we are celebrating the birth of Jesus. It was simply, it's Christmas time. Look at these beautiful carols, or rather, listen to these beautiful carols.
Yeah.
How
That is
about you? Did you
interesting.
have something like that?
I mean, yeah, we listen to. My mom loves to have Christmas music on, but see, it's because both of my parents are some form of Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So even though I don't identify as Christian, it was never strange, I guess, or I never questioned the fact that they would be happy to put on songs praising Jesus because they would go to church. And there were a couple of years where we were forced to. I'm sure if we had really kicked up a fuss, he wouldn't have forced us to. But we were ushered to midnight mass with my father a couple of years. After my mom never really went to church, but she was still very in her beliefs being Christian, but she has a very complicated relationship with the church because she's Catholic, and Catholicism and the Catholic Church has had a bit of questionable stuff going on. So that's why she pulled away, but rather than questioning the belief aspect of it. So she just didn't like the organization and the corruption of it. But my dad, particularly after the divorce, became very embedded in his beliefs. And we, had to say grace before having a meal at McDonald's, type of.
Okay.
Yes. So he's very solid in his Christianity. And I remember having multiple conversations with him about it when I was getting more fascinated by the interworkings of religion, but not because I was interested in it from a personal perspective. We would have really long conversations about what exactly the Trinity is. I remember having not a debate, it was more of I was asking him questions about it because I thought that if Jesus was also considered God, isn't that breaking the commandment of there being only one God? And he was having to sit and explain the very, very complicated aspect of the Trinity, which is also different depending on which branch of Christianity you really fall into. So it's a really complicated idea. And I remember telling some of my theologian friends that we were having this conversation, and they were like, oh my God, that is a complicated conversation to try to hold. But yeah, so for me, it was a very different backing. Christmas was always somewhat religious, even if it wasn't overtly. So my mom kept it less overtly than my dad did, but it was still kind of there. We still had a couple of Jesus things. My mom had the nativity scene always, which I just had a sudden memory. We used to take the baby Jesus and hide it because then it would make my mom walk around looking for Jesus, and we just thought that was really funny.
Why not?
So, that's also a very fun memory. I think if I had a nativity scene, I would just hide Jesus every year because that's the nostalgia that I would associate with a Jesus thing. But yeah, so I think it's slightly different that I grew up with the religious overtone much more prominently.
Yeah.
But I was also never a big fan of Christmas music. I'm still not a huge fan of Christmas music. And this last year, because of COVID and everything, me and my husband had Christmas just together. And it was the first year where we did it just the two of us. And I don't think we really played a lot of Christmas music.
Are you referring to carols and hymns or pop
Yeah.
music?
Well, I think both. We
Okay.
didn't really have either playing. Not that I remember. I think Tom might correct me. But that being said, then on Halloween, I was playing Halloween music quite extensively. So I just have my priorities slightly different.
Yeah, I do play a lot of Christmas pop music, I will say. And I even like some of the overplayed stuff because
So
of
I only know
nostalgia.
I think Christmas pop music is much bigger in the UK than it is in the
Oh,
US.
it's a market in the UK.
It's like a thing.
Yeah,
And people will put out like their Christmas hit.
yeah, and certain artists will make an entire living out of their Christmas hits.
Yeah.
I remember reading that Noddy Holder from Slade has a holiday in the Barbados every year from the royalties he's made from the previous Christmas. From
Jeez.
Merry Christmas, everybody. Because it gets played that much.
My
Yeah.
God.
And yeah, it is very much and people get very passionate in the UK as well. Speaking of nostalgia and religioning, people get very passionate in the UK about what the best Christmas song is, or what
Yes.
makes a good Christmas song and what makes a bad Christmas song. And there are some really strongly held opinions. And I'm not saying this as as a smug outsider either. I am one of these people. I have opinions on Christmas pop music, and I will argue until I'm blue in the face as well.
I feel like we should have a whole separate episode on just Christmas pop music because I
Yeah.
feel like this could be a whole rabbit hole of not only what makes it good from different people's perspectives, but also just the whole the merchandising of it, the whole like industry around it, and then at the same time the whole appeal of but we shouldn't be having lots of commercialization of Christmas, but then you'll kind of feed into this industry of music at the same time, and it's a really complicated paradox.
Yes, I find that as well with so many Christmas films that emphasize the true meaning of Christmas, that it's not about the corporate side and so on. It's about being with family, yet you're still watching a film about Santa made by a multi-million-dollar industry. It's one of those instances where capitalism tries to look anti-capitalistic, for want of a better
Yeah,
term.
I have I mean this is also another little rabbit hole, but there's a really interesting thing that I have found recently that most anti-capitalist ideas from capitalist countries use capitalism to fight capitalism, which is really this because it's difficult to conceive of another way of doing it when you're so embedded in the systems. But that's a whole nother conversation, I think,
Yeah, yeah.
that we can really get into. But yeah, I think that a lot of this, and I think Christmas is a good example of this as well, is that sometimes you can be nostalgic for future aspects. And I mentioned that this was the first year that me and my husband had a Christmas, just the two of us. And during it, we were talking about how we would go about doing Christmas, just the two of us, from this point forward. And what would our traditions be, and how would we go about doing it where he can still see his family sometimes. And we were talking about what years we would do it off and on, and then what we would be doing during those years. And it made me very almost nostalgic for what it's going to be like 10 years,
Yes,
15
yeah.
years down the road, where we are very embedded in the nature of how you do things. That even though it wasn't even set up and I didn't know what I was going to be nostalgic for in 10 to 15 years, I was still getting nostalgic thinking about how I would be.
Yeah, yeah. We're the same. We've had a few Christmases on our own now, and I get nostalgic for the things that we do. And we've tried to incorporate things that both of us did with our own families. So we've created almost this hybrid of each other's Christmases. Christmas. Yeah, yeah. Christmas is definitely one of those powerful, nostalgic, religious aspects in the West. Um,
Yeah.
and it's also a lot of it is yearning for a time where one was happy. I mean, I'm not saying that we're not happy now, but sometimes you think back and think, oh, those were good times. And a
Yeah, it's
lot,
simple times as well.
yeah. Even though there's no such thing as simple times,
Well, no.
it gets interpreted as such.
A lot of it, I think, is perception. Like I think of my childhood Christmases as being simpler times, but it was primarily because I was a kid and therefore wasn't aware of
How much Christmas dinner is going to cost.
yeah, exactly. And the logistics of it. And I remember there was a couple of years where my mom was really, really poor, and so our Christmases were a bit funky. And there was one year in particular where we dressed up a house plant as our Christmas tree because we couldn't afford one. But my mom was always very good at, like, whenever we were in that situation of being like, it's a fun new thing I'm trying, right? And I remember when I was a bit older and I was going, I really liked that. And halfway through telling her about how, oh, do you remember when we dressed up the house plant as a Christmas tree? And then halfway through saying it, I was going, oh, it's because we couldn't afford a Christmas tree, which shows how complicated and stressful that probably was for her.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think of it as a simple, happy time that was free of stress, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, yeah. And you were both experiencing the same activity, but from two different ends,
Yeah.
which is really interesting.
It is very interesting. And it was so much of a memory, and it was only 1 year that we did that, but it stuck out so much in my memory that there was a point where I was debating on doing that with my houseplants this last year. Of going, well, what if we just dress up one of my houseplants and that would be fun? And I couldn't quite figure out how to do it without hurting the houseplant because I didn't have, we had done it with a viney one, so it had a cage to climb around. So we were primarily hanging things on the cage rather than on the plant itself. But I don't have one of those, so I couldn't quite manage it. But yeah, so the fact that I was thinking of calling on that nostalgia for a simpler, happier time, that was probably one of the most stressful Christmases of my mother's life, probably. And I saw it as this great thing to replicate, to remember. And I think that happens a lot when we talk about the social ones as well, is that it typically plays on what was the simplest times for the people who experienced it the simplest. And so this is when you get into power dynamics of society, of primarily the white heterosexual male voice becomes the marker of what times are the nostalgic times for a society.
Yes, I know what you're referring to here.
Yes, so this kind of plays into both the religion audience, the popular culture audience, nostalgia, and politics. Because there was the great infamous campaign of Donald Trump in 2016 that was on the idea of Make America Great Again, calling on this idea of the cultural, social nostalgia of a simpler time, an easier time, a happier time. And of course, all of that didn't exist, but if it did exist, it was for a very specific group of people.
Yes, it was great for a very small elite minority.
Yes, and typically that elite minority was also very heavily Protestant. So you get the what was the simple happy time for the WASPs of America is what becomes the marker of the social, and that there were people who bought into this narrative, even though those times that they're recalling back for wouldn't have been great for those people either.
Yeah, absolutely. It's recalling to a time when a lot of people didn't have many rights.
Yes.
We have a similar thing in the UK with, or rather we did, because they've kind of really faded into obscurity since Brexit, with UKIP. Frankie Boyle does a really funny stand-up routine about UKIP's yearning for the good old days, and how much of their politics was based on taking the UK back to what it was before it joined the EU in the mid-1970s. But he goes through this entire, and I can't do it justice because I'm not a comedian, but about how absurd this idea of the better times or the good old days, when it's a complete fabrication for the most part, and a nostalgia for something that didn't exist.
Yeah. But it's a powerful feeling and sentiment to be essentially weaponizing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where, this kind of conversation about social and cultural nostalgia can really, that's where I think we see it the most, is in politics and in the way that people try to call you back to, oh, remember when you weren't stressed out about money.
Yeah, and that Brexit campaign played on a lot of similar themes as "Make America Great Again." The big Brexit
Yeah.
phrase was "Take back control." Take back control. In other words, you've lost control, but you once had
Yeah.
it. So it was all based on it was essentially "Make Britain Great Again." Was the drive of that campaign. And yeah, it's a lot of us versus them mentality as well. The entire idea of making America great again was putting up walls. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, if you pardon the pun, because obviously that was a big
It
part
was,
of
it was
it.
quite a literal one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but just putting up walls between America and the rest of the world, and
And yeah, and it's important to, and this is getting too into the political side of it. Well, not really the human rights side of it, but into the politics of Donald Trump, of saying that where the wall was being built was not on Canada's border. And I think that's,
yes,
a really important demonstration of who is considered welcome into the old times. That in the old times, there weren't brown people and black people walking around where you don't think that they should be. So, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Sorry, that's just brought the mood down a little bit, doesn't it? We were talking about Christmas a few minutes ago.
We were talking about happy things, but I think this is a really important discussion of nostalgia, and we'll maybe try to end on a happy note before we kind of close out of this. But I think it's important to keep in mind that even though we talk about nostalgia as being all happy memories, it can always be weaponized against other people, and that there are, in every happy memory that even an individual has, there are voices and ideas that are being silenced, whether it's personally from a lack of experience of, say, better game mechanics, that you think this is the most amazing game mechanics because you don't know any better yet, so therefore it is the best. And so that's what you remember. Or if it's not really realizing that your mother is struggling as much as you realize, and so for you it's this happy memory of no stress and everything's great because you are not aware of the other stressors, or if it's the silenced voices of minority groups. So yeah, well, I guess not even minority groups, lots of minority groups, which make it the majority, that are also being silenced in the conversation. And so I think that sometimes that's what makes nostalgia really tricky, is that, and that's, it's always playing up a very particular perspective that's very difficult to control and is very difficult to articulate a lot of the times because it's from a very particular perspective. So let's end on something a little bit more upbeat and tell me one thing that is the most nostalgic thing you have experienced or thought of recently.
Ooh, thought of recently. Sorry, I don't want to leave dead air on that.
Shall I?
No, oh, you go first, because
Okay.
it seems to me like you've already prepped an answer.
Well, only pseudo, but I was just thinking about it as we were talking about stuff because I think we talked about it in a What's Interesting About episode, is that I was starting to try to parse out TikTok, which is the most old I think I've ever sounded in that sentence. But I have been exploring TikTok and getting a little bit more accustomed to it. And I have discovered that there's a couple of the old Backstreet Boys are on TikTok. And there is a really big TikTok at the moment from, I think, Nick Carter's account of, it's two of the Backstreet Boys and two of the NSYNC boys. And they're all doing one of the NSYNC dances to one of their songs of Bye Bye Bye. And watching it, and it's these old old men they just look like dads now. Because they don't even look like, how Justin Timberlake does. They just, all four of them just look like dads. But they're dancing the NSYNC dances. And there was just something really weirdly nostalgic about seeing it, about hearing the music, but also about seeing it in the contemporary moment of the dads doing it. And there was a certain sense of remembering, the dads from like our dads, like making fun of things and messing about, and it feeling like that. So there was this kind of fun. So go check out that TikTok from Nick Carter. I think it was great.
Well, okay, my example then, if I could have the liberty of picking one from 6-7 years ago, but I think it ties in nicely with what you were saying. In 2014, McFly and Busted combined forces to create Muck Busted, which was rather the most insane nostalgia trip ever made. The entire tour, well, they did 2 tours. I went to both, humble brag. Were built on nostalgia because Busted had split up, over a decade before. McFly was still going, but Busted had split up over a decade before. And the tours were them playing all these now, classic songs in the sense that they're old songs that people remember, in one show, performing each other's songs together. And it was a huge nostalgia trip. And it was one of those things like you were saying about Good Charlotte, I still remembered all the words to What I Go to School For and Air Hostess. So, and that definitely did make me nostalgic for seeing Busted on TV when I was a kid, jumping up and down with their guitars. And I think they were quite revolutionary in a way. They certainly were that gateway between the pop boy band oriented style of NSYNC and Backstreet Boys and what came afterwards, where boy bands had a little bit more of a pop rock edge, which you even saw up until like One Direction very recently.
Yeah.
I think Busted and McFly were that kind of turning point where it's like, okay, our boy bands rock a bit now. So I know they get very cross with being called boy bands, which I do get. So yeah, that's my example because but both Victoria and I loved McBusted, and it was because of that nostalgia, because we loved those songs when we were young kids, and it was a hugely successful project. It was a hugely successful tour. They saw everything sold out in an instant, and it was based on nostalgia.
Yeah.
It was a nostalgia tour, and sometimes you see that a lot of old acts will like team up with others to go on these tours. But I think McBusted was a bit of a phenomenon. Did you pay much attention to?
No, but so a lot of that is different background, being an immigrant. I only knew vaguely of McFly before I moved here. And I didn't really know Busted, so like it wasn't something that kind of pinged on my radar, I think, because of that. But yeah, I only know some of the McFly songs, but there was I can't remember which other. It wasn't Busted or McFly, but it was some other boy band from the UK that Tom was surprised I didn't know about. But it was just because they didn't really make it over to the US, and so we were listening to some of their music the other day.
Yeah. They did try to crack America, but it just didn't go. Just didn't go as they planned. But in the UK, they were the biggest band. Busted were the biggest band in the country between I'd say 2002, 2004, something like that.
Yeah.
They were very much part of the zeitgeist.
Because I was here in 2014, I think. Yeah, I think I was here in 2014. I was, at some point. I think the end of 2014.
Yeah.
So I was only still kind of finding my UK legs.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, it was... I've been here a long time,
You
man.
have now. You're,
Yeah. Starting to get nostalgic for UK things.
oh gosh, be careful. Your
Well,
UKIP membership card is in the post.
oh, I would confuse the hell out of them. I'm an immigrant, but I'm white.
Yeah, what?
If people want to talk to you about McBusted and vinyl records and everything else regarding nostalgia, where can they go, Alad?
I suggest they hit me up on Twitter at AlaJLL where they can talk to me about all sorts of things. I have recently completed Persona 5, and I am obsessed. So on the topic of video games, if anybody wants to discuss that with me on Twitter, please do. How about you, Vivian? Where can they find you if they want to discuss putting Christmas decorations on plants?
You can find me also on Twitter and on Instagram. Both are at Vivian Asimos. I'm trying to get much better at using Instagram. I know it's bad sometimes, and I'll go weeks without it. I promise. I'm getting better. And you can also check out my website, incidentalmythology.com. And we also have an event coming up where Alad is going to be giving a talk on Free Zone Scientology. You can find it through our website, altac.uk, alt-ac.uk. You can find all the information about it there. But I'm going to be moderating it. So if you want to see both of our lovely faces, that's probably a good thing to sign up for.
Yeah, it's going to be a really good time, I think.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to having loads of Scientologists in the...
It'll be a bit more structured than the way I am on this podcast, I think. I'll write out what I'm going to say beforehand. But at the same time, I'm not going to read it word for word, just so that everybody knows. But I'm not going to be like that. But it'll hopefully be somewhat professional.
Yeah, so I'll put a link to the information on the event page in the description of this episode, but you can also check it out on our website if you are not in a, I don't know, if you get this deleted from your playlist or something on whatever you are listening to by then. So yeah, thank you for listening, and thank you, Alad, for chatting to me about nostalgia.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.